stepfather installed a family tracking app to control me after my dad died, then gaslit my mom into believing I was the problem, isolated me from friends, and tried to send me to a boarding school prison. So I turned his own manipulation against him and exposed his dark secrets. I was eating breakfast when my stepfather Jesse announced he was installing a family tracking app on all our phones. He said it was for safety reasons since there had been break-ins in the neighborhood, but his eyes locked onto mine with this predatory intensity that made every alarm bell in my head start screaming. Mom just sat there agreeing with him like a zombie, completely checked out from reality ever since Jesse swooped in 6 months ago. You see, Jesse had slithered into our lives after dad died when we were drowning in hospital bills. At first, mom worshipped him like some kind of saint, but I'd been cataloging his disgusting behavior for weeks. The way his hands would linger on my shoulders during those revolting too long hugs, or how he'd suddenly appear wherever I was in the house like he'd been hunting me. When I tried telling mom, she'd explode with this vicious defensiveness, screaming about how ungrateful I was to the man who saved us from living in our car. The tracking app felt like a noose tightening around my neck. He handed my phone over with those dead shark eyes gleaming, and started demonstrating how he could watch my every movement in real time. Then he dropped the bomb that shattered what was left of my world. He'd been tracking my after-school activities and wanted to know exactly what I was really doing there. Mom perched beside him, nodding like a brainwashed cult member, while he explained how this was just good parenting. When I tried to fight back, Jesse's voice went deadly quiet, and he reminded me that he owns my phone, my car, and my entire existence now. Mom immediately started shrieking about how lucky I was to have someone who cared so much, and that I needed to stop being such a spoiled brat. That night, I stared at my phone knowing this psychopath could monitor my every breath. The next morning, I jolted awake to find Jesse standing in my doorway fully dressed, like he'd been stationed there for hours, just watching me sleep. He claimed he wanted to check on me since I seemed upset, but the way his eyes crawled over my body made me want to vomit. When I demanded he leave, he actually stepped further into my room and planted himself on my bed, running his fingers through my hair while whispering about how beautiful I looked when I was vulnerable. I recoiled like he'd burned me, and Whisper screamed at him to get out, but he just chuckled and said I was being hysterical. Later at school, I desperately tried explaining the situation to one of my teachers. But how do you convince someone that your stepfather is a predator when he hasn't technically crossed any legal lines yet? She listened and scribbled notes, but ultimately delivered the crushing blow that without concrete evidence, there was nothing anyone could do. She suggested family therapy, which was laughable since mom thought Jesse walked on water. When I walked through our front door that afternoon, Jesse was waiting like a spider in his web. He interrogated me about why I'd lingered an extra 20 minutes after classes, demanding to know if I was spreading lies about our family to school officials. I stammered some excuse about using the bathroom, but he kept drilling deeper, asking specifically about counselors and teachers like he could read my mind. Mom materialized during this interrogation, and instead of protecting me, she started attacking me for potentially embarrassing our family at school. That's when the last shred of hope in my chest died as I realized I was completely alone with these two monsters. Jesse's face lit up with pure satisfaction at mom's betrayal, and he suggested maybe I needed constant supervision since I clearly couldn't be trusted with any freedom. Mom agreed instantly, gushing about how teenagers today are too spoiled and need firmer boundaries. I watched my own mother choose this predator over her daughter and felt something inside me break forever. That night, Jesse invaded my room again, this time sitting on my bed for an eternity while his hand rested on my thigh. When I told him he was violating my boundaries, he said I was being dramatic, that physical closeness was healthy in real families. He stayed there talking about how ungrateful daughters sometimes need special attention to learn proper behavior. The next morning, I caught him rifling through my dresser drawers. He spun some obvious lie about putting away laundry, but I could see he'd been searching through my most private belongings, looking for God knows what. When I confronted him, his mask finally slipped and he erupted with this terrifying rage, telling me I was paranoid and disrespectful. Mom came running in, but instead of questioning why this man was violating my privacy, she screamed at me for being hostile to our family savior. She said if I couldn't learn gratitude, maybe I should find somewhere else to live when I turn 18. Jesse wrapped his arm around her shoulders like he owned her, and suggested they start researching boarding schools to fix my attitude problem. Full story on channel linked below. I lay in bed that night scrolling through boarding school websites on my phone, my stomach churning as I read the admission requirements. Every single one demanded detailed financial information from parents, bank statements, tax returns, proof of income. The realization hit me like ice water. Jesse wasn't just trying to get rid of me, he was making sure I'd disappear completely from anyone who might help. My fingers trembled as I clicked through page after page of these prison-like facilities masquerading as schools. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, hoping to grab breakfast and escape before Jesse started his daily performance. But when I crept into the kitchen, he was already there, leaning against the counter like he'd been waiting. His eyes immediately zeroed in on my phone clutched in my hand. He moved toward me with that predatory grace that made my skin crawl. His hand shot out, palm up, demanding my phone to check my internet history. I clutched it tighter against my chest and took a step back. That's when something shifted in his face, the mask he wore for mom completely vanishing. His voice dropped to this cold, threatening tone I'd never heard before, each word precise and sharp like a blade. The kitchen suddenly felt too small as he advanced on me, backing me into the corner by the refrigerator. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pressed myself against the cold metal, still refusing to hand over my phone. His jaw clenched and unclenched, a muscle twitching near his temple. That's when mom walked in, still in her bathrobe. She took one look at the scene, me cornered, Jesse looming over me, and immediately started shrieking at me. She demanded I hand over my phone right now, grounding me from all technology except what I needed for school. Jesse's lips curled into this satisfied smirk as mom did his dirty work for him. I had no choice but to surrender my phone, watching helplessly as Jesse's fingers flew across the screen, checking everything. Mom stood beside him, nodding approvingly, completely oblivious to how she'd just helped him tighten his control over me. At school during lunch, I borrowed a friend's phone to check my messages. My best friend Jess had texted me dozens of times over the past few days, growing increasingly worried about my silence. The latest messages were frantic, asking if I was okay, why I wasn't responding. My blood ran cold as I scrolled through our conversation history and realized Jesse had been monitoring everything, blocking me from responding to certain messages. I handed the phone back, my mind racing. He wasn't just watching, he was actively controlling my communications, deciding who I could and couldn't talk to. The isolation was deliberate. deliberate, systematic. That afternoon in study hall, I made a desperate decision. I tore pages from the back of my chemistry textbook, the ripping sound making me flinch even though the library was nearly empty. Using a borrowed pen, I started documenting everything. Dates, times, specific incidents. My handwriting was shaky, but I forced myself to be thorough, creating evidence that Jesse couldn't delete or monitor. I folded the pages carefully and tucked them into my school locker behind my gym clothes. It wasn't much, but it was something he couldn't access, couldn't control. My own private record of the nightmare I was living. When I got home that afternoon, I immediately sensed something was wrong. My bedroom door was slightly ajar even though I always closed it completely. I pushed it open slowly, my heart sinking at what I saw. My dresser drawers were all perfectly aligned, too perfectly. Jesse had been in here again, but this time he'd reorganized everything with military precision. My diary was gone. I tore through my room searching for it, checking under my mattress, in my closet, behind my desk, nothing. The leather journal where I'd been documenting Jesse's behavior for weeks had vanished like it never existed. I found Jesse in the living room, calmly reading a newspaper like he hadn't just violated my privacy again. When I confronted him about my missing diary, he looked up with those dead eyes and claimed he'd never seen any diary. But he watched my face too carefully, studying my reaction like he was cataloging exactly what I might have written about him. He set down the newspaper and leaned forward, asking specific questions about what kinds of complaints I'd been making, who I'd been talking to about our family situation. Each question was precise, probing, designed to figure out how much evidence I'd gathered and who might know about it. Over the next few days, Jesse's campaign to isolate me intensified. He started calling my friends' parents, introducing himself as my concerned stepfather. He'd spin stories about my behavioral changes, suggesting I was going through a difficult phase and might be a bad influence. His voice would drip with false concern as he recommended limiting contact with me for their children's well-being. Jess pulled me aside after PE class, her face twisted with confusion and hurt. Her parents had received one of Jesse's calls and now wouldn't let her hang out with me anymore. Jesse had painted me as unstable, possibly even dangerous. The worst part was how believable he'd made it sound. A caring stepfather worried about his troubled stepdaughter. One by one, my friends started pulling away. Their parents had all received similar calls, all heard the same poisonous narrative about my deteriorating mental state. Jesse was systematically destroying my support network, cutting me off from anyone who might help or believe me. That night, Jesse made another of his bedroom visits. This time I was ready. I'd hidden my phone under my pillow with the voice memo app already open. As soon as I heard his footsteps in the hallway, I pressed record. He sat on my bed again, his weight making the mattress dip. His hand found my shoulder, squeezing just hard enough to hurt. He started talking in that low, threatening tone about how disappointed he was in my behavior, how ungrateful I was being. The recording captured everything, his true voice, the menace beneath the concerned stepfather act. But my small victory was short-lived. The next morning, Jesse confiscated my phone completely, claiming I'd violated the family technology rules. The voice recording was trapped on a device I no longer had access to. Later that week, I overheard Jesse on a phone call that made my blood freeze. He was discussing residential programs for troubled teens, asking about intake procedures and how quickly they could accommodate a new student. The person on the other end was apparently walking him through different options: therapeutic boarding schools, wilderness programs, residential treatment centers. I pressed myself against the wall outside his office, straining to hear every word. Jesse was taking notes, asking about programs specifically designed for defiant teenagers with behavioral issues. He wanted to know about visitation policies, communication restrictions, how long the programs typically lasted. The boarding school threat wasn't just intimidation anymore. He was actively making plans to ship me away to one of these teen prison camps where I'd have no voice, no way to reach out for help. My grades started slipping as the stress consumed me. I couldn't concentrate in class, couldn't focus on homework when I knew Jesse was planning my disappearance. Every failed quiz, every missing assignment just gave him more ammunition for his narrative about my deteriorating mental state. Mrs. Rodriguez, my English teacher, noticed the change immediately. She kept me after class one day, her kind eyes full of concern. She asked gentle questions about what was happening at home, why my performance had declined so dramatically. I wanted desperately to tell her everything, but fear kept my mouth shut. What if she called Jesse? What if her concern just made things worse? I mumbled something about stress and family issues, unable to meet her eyes. She didn't push, but I could see the worry etched on her face as I gathered my things and fled her classroom. During lunch detention the next day, I found myself alone with Mr. Chen, my biology teacher. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was his quiet, non-judgmental presence, but I took a calculated risk. I started talking, carefully at first, testing the waters. Mr. Chen listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. He asked about specific incidents, whether I felt safe at home, if there had been any physical violence. When I explained about the bedroom visits, the missing diary, the systematic isolation, his expression grew increasingly grave, but then came the crushing blow. Mr. Chen explained, gently but firmly, that without concrete evidence of abuse or immediate danger, there were severe limitations on what teachers could do. The inappropriate bedroom visits were concerning, but not technically illegal. The controlling behavior was troubling, but fell into a gray area. Without bruises, without explicit threats, without something provable, the system couldn't intervene. He suggested documenting everything, keeping records, finding trusted adults who could support me. But I could see in his eyes the same helplessness I felt. The system wasn't designed to protect kids from predators who were smart enough to stay just within legal boundaries. I left that meeting understanding a harsh truth. Even sympathetic adults needed proof I didn't have. Jesse had been too careful, too calculated. Every violation had been crafted to maximum psychological damage, while staying just shy of anything actionable. A few days later, Mom's sister Jessica called the house unexpectedly. I happened to be closest to the phone and grabbed it before Jesse could intercept. Jessica's warm voice filled my ear, asking how everyone was doing, if we needed anything. I glanced around frantically, seeing Jesse in the kitchen. I had seconds at most. I whispered urgently that something was wrong, that I needed help, but before I could say more, Jesse's hand clamped down on my shoulder. He pried the phone from my grip, his fingers digging into my skin hard enough to bruise, but his voice was perfectly pleasant as he greeted Jessica, explaining that I'd been having some behavioral issues lately and was being dramatic. He controlled the entire conversation, steering it away from anything substantive while maintaining his perfect stepfather facade. But Jessica wasn't stupid. Something in Jesse's overly controlling responses, The way he wouldn't let her talk to me again triggered her suspicions. Before hanging up, she mentioned she'd be in town tomorrow and would love to stop by for a visit. Jesse's mask slipped for just a moment, panic flashing across his face before he recovered. He agreed to the visit with false enthusiasm, but I could see his mind already working, planning how to manage this unexpected threat to his control. That evening was a frenzy of preparation. Jesse coached Mom extensively on what to say, how to act, what topics to avoid. He made her rehearse responses about my behavior, my supposed mental health issues, the loving family environment they'd created. Mom parroted everything back perfectly, her dead eyes never questioning why they needed such elaborate preparation for a simple family visit. Jesse turned his attention to me next, laying out exactly what I was and wasn't allowed to discuss with Jessica. Any deviation, any attempt to signal for help, and he'd accelerate my placement in a residential facility. The threat was explicit now: cooperate or disappear. When Jessica arrived the next afternoon, the house felt like a stage set for a performance. Jesse played the concerned stepfather perfectly. Mom robotically supported every word, and I sat frozen with fear, unable to break through the elaborate charade. Jessica's sharp eyes took in everything: the way I flinched when Jesse touched my shoulder, Mom's overly bright smile that never reached her eyes, the suffocating tension that permeated every interaction. She asked careful questions, probing gently, but Jesse deflected masterfully. By the time Jessica left, I could see the frustration in her face. She knew something was wrong, but Jesse's performance had been too polished, too convincing. He'd successfully painted me as a troubled teenager going through a difficult phase, nothing more sinister than typical adolescent rebellion. As her car pulled away, my last hope seemed to disappear with it. Jesse's satisfied smirk told me he knew it too. He'd won this round, proved that his control extended even to family visits. The boarding school research would continue, and now he could claim even Jessica agreed I was just being a dramatic teenager. Jesse's triumphant expression after Jessica's departure made my stomach turn. He immediately began leveraging her visit as proof that I was trying to turn family against each other. Mom nodded along as he explained how my attempts to manipulate Jessica showed I needed immediate professional help. His voice carried that false concern he'd perfected, but underneath I could hear the satisfaction of another victory. I recognized the tactics from articles I'd read online about psychological abuse, isolation, gaslighting, turning potential allies against the victim. Jesse was following the playbook perfectly, and I was trapped in his carefully constructed narrative. The following week, the school nurse called me to her office. She'd noticed my weight loss and the dark circles under my eyes during a routine health screening. Her gentle questions about my eating habits and sleep patterns made me realize how visible the stress had become. She documented everything in her files, becoming the first adult to create an official record of the physical toll Jesse's psychological warfare was taking on me. When the nurse called home to discuss her concerns, Jesse immediately scheduled a doctor's appointment. He framed it as addressing my apparent eating disorder and depression, weaponizing my body's stress responses as further evidence of my supposed mental instability. Mom sat in the waiting room while Jesse accompanied me into the examination room, his presence ensuring I couldn't speak freely. During the appointment, the doctor asked for a few minutes alone with me for routine adolescent health questions. My heart raced with the possibility of finally telling someone, but when the moment came, fear paralyzed me. Jesse's threats echoed in my mind, and without physical evidence of abuse, I knew how it would sound. I denied any problems at home, missing what might have been my only chance for medical intervention. Walking out of that office, I felt the weight of my cowardice. I'd let fear win again, and Jesse's satisfied expression showed he knew it. But something shifted in me that day, a determination that next time, I'd be braver. That resolve was tested sooner than expected. Jesse's ex-wife Sarah called the house looking for him about their shared daughter. I answered the phone while Jesse was outside, and something in Sarah's careful tone made me listen closely. She mentioned needing to discuss custody arrangements, specifically about their daughter continuing to live with her full-time for her own protection. The way Sarah emphasized those last 3 words sent chills down my spine. This was someone who understood Jesse's true nature. I managed to keep her talking for a few precious minutes, learning that their daughter had been living exclusively with Sarah for over 2 years. Sarah's voice carried a weight of experience, a knowing that made me feel less alone. Before Jesse returned, Sarah whispered urgently for me to be careful and document everything. The line went dead just as Jesse walked through the door, but not before I'd heard the validation I desperately needed. Someone else knew what he was capable of. Jesse's paranoia after Sarah's call was palpable. He interrogated me about every word exchanged, his questions revealing how threatened he felt by any outside contact. His mask slipped repeatedly as he demanded to know if Sarah had said anything about him, about their past, about why their daughter lived with her. I played dumb, but inside I was cataloging his fear. Jesse's control had weak points. A few days later, I discovered my backpack had been searched. The letter I'd written to Jessica explaining everything was gone. Jesse had been systematically going through my belongings, looking for any evidence of my attempts to reach out. The violation felt complete. Even my school bag wasn't safe from his surveillance. Jesse used the discovered letter as leverage, offering me a deal. If I stopped causing problems and accepted the help he and Mom were offering, he'd consider letting me stay home instead of sending me to boarding school. But I recognized the manipulation. This wasn't mercy. It was another control tactic. Mom pressured me to accept Jesse's generous offer, revealing the depth of her complicity. She knew exactly what was happening but had chosen Jesse's financial security over my safety. Her words cut deeper than any of Jesse's threats because they came from someone who was supposed to protect me. Through careful observation, I noticed patterns in Jesse's schedule. He claimed to have client meetings several evenings a week, but for someone in his supposed day job, the timing didn't add up. These inconsistencies suggested Jesse might be hiding more than just his predatory behavior. I realized Jesse's hold over Mom went beyond money. She seemed genuinely terrified of being alone again, of returning to the financial desperation we'd faced after Dad's death. Jesse had positioned himself as her savior, and she clung to that narrative even as it destroyed her daughter. My research into abuse survival stories online gave me new strategies. I stopped engaging in family dinners where Jesse could corner me, instead grabbing food and retreating to my room. This small act of defiance felt monumental. I was learning to protect myself within the constraints of my situation. Mrs. Rodriguez noticed my increased confidence and offered to let me eat lunch in her classroom. This daily reprieve became my sanctuary, a place where Jesse's reach couldn't extend. We developed subtle signals. If I needed help, I'd leave a specific book on her desk. It wasn't much, but it was something. During a family discussion about my behavior, I employed a new tactic. Instead of defending myself or getting emotional, Meanwhile, I calmly asked Jesse specific questions about his concerns. Why exactly did he think I needed residential treatment? What specific behaviors warranted such extreme measures? His inability to provide concrete answers without revealing his true motivations left him visibly flustered for the first time. One evening while Jesse showered, I noticed he'd left his work laptop open on the kitchen table. My hands shook as I quickly navigated to his browser history, finding extensive research on controlling teenage behavior, therapeutic boarding schools, and legal guardianship rights. I managed to screenshot several pages onto a flash drive I'd hidden in my backpack before the water shut off. Mom began showing cracks in her blind support when Jesse suggested immediate placement at a facility he'd found. Something about the urgency made her hesitate, questioning why they couldn't try local therapy first. Jesse's irritation at her resistance revealed how accustomed he'd become to her complete compliance. Jessica called again, and this time I managed a longer conversation while Jesse was occupied. I carefully planted seeds of doubt about Jesse's narrative, mentioning how isolated I'd become and how my friends' parents had all received similar calls about my supposed instability. Jessica's questions grew more pointed, her concern more evident. When Jessica offered to have me visit for a weekend, Jesse faced a dilemma. Refusing would look controlling, but agreeing meant temporarily losing his grip on me. He chose to allow it, but spent hours coaching me on acceptable topics of conversation, his desperation to maintain his image becoming increasingly apparent. The weekend at Jessica's house felt like breathing fresh air after months of suffocation. She noticed how I relaxed away from home, how my appetite returned, how I smiled more freely. The contrast to my behavior at home validated what I'd been trying to tell people. The problem wasn't me. Jesse's text messages during the visit grew increasingly demanding. He wanted constant updates on our activities, became angry when I didn't respond immediately, and sent multiple messages about missing me that felt more like surveillance than affection. Jessica witnessed these exchanges firsthand, her expression growing more concerned with each notification. In a private moment, Jessica mentioned that Jesse's behavior reminded her of Mom's ex-boyfriend from years ago, someone who'd seemed perfect at first, but gradually revealed controlling tendencies. This family history of recognizing abuse patterns gave me hope that Jessica might be the ally I desperately needed. Returning home after the weekend felt like walking back into a cage, but Jessica's validation had strengthened something inside me. I moved differently, spoke with more confidence, and Jesse noticed. His attempts to reassert control became more desperate, more obvious. Jessica began calling more frequently and making unexpected visits. As an adult with her own resources, she couldn't be manipulated like my teenage friends. Jesse's frustration with this development was evident in his increasingly agitated behavior whenever she was mentioned. Mom started questioning their approach to handling my supposed problems. Jessica's presence had disrupted the echo chamber Jesse had created, introducing doubt into Mom's certainty about my need for institutional help. Her independent thinking, however small, represented the first crack in Jesse's complete control over her. My improved mental state from having Jessica's support led to better performance at school. Teachers noticed my renewed focus, undermining Jesse's narrative about my deteriorating condition. Every good grade, every positive interaction chipped away at the case he'd been building. During another of Jesse's shower times, I managed to copy his browser history onto my flash drive, creating a backup of the evidence I'd found. My hands moved quickly, efficiently, powered by the knowledge that I was building a case of my own. Jesse announced he'd found the perfect therapeutic boarding school that had an opening in 2 weeks. The facility specialized in troubled teens with behavioral issues, and he'd already begun the application process. The countdown to my potential disappearance had officially begun. Jessica demanded to tour the facility before any decisions were made. Jesse couldn't refuse without seeming unreasonable, so he reluctantly agreed to include her in the process. This forced involvement of an outside adult clearly frustrated his plans. The boarding school visit was a revelation. What Jesse had described as a therapeutic environment was actually a lockdown facility with barred windows, monitored phone calls, and strict isolation protocols. Jessica's horror was visible as we toured the grounds, while I maintained calm composure that contrasted sharply with Jesse's description of my supposed instability. In the car afterward, Jessica confronted Mom about sending me to what amounted to a juvenile detention center. Mom struggled to articulate why I needed such extreme intervention, her rehearsed responses crumbling under Jessica's direct questions. The disconnect between Jesse's narrative and reality was becoming impossible to ignore. Mom's inability to justify the boarding school placement marked a turning point. For the first time, she questioned Jesse's assessment of my mental state. The doubt was small, but it was there, flickering in her eyes as she looked between Jesse and Jessica. Jessica's threat to seek legal guardianship if I was sent to the facility created the first real external challenge to Jesse's authority. The possibility of legal intervention, of outside oversight, struck at the foundation of his carefully constructed control system. Jesse responded by trying to accelerate my placement, moving up the timeline to prevent Jessica from taking legal action. His desperation was showing, the careful facade cracking under pressure from someone he couldn't manipulate or intimidate. I realized this was my last chance. The evidence I'd collected, the documentation I'd hidden, the recordings trapped on my confiscated phone, it was time to take the ultimate risk. I gathered everything I could access and prepared to show Jessica the full scope of what I'd been enduring. The moment of truth came during Jessica's next visit. While Mom and Jesse were in the kitchen, I handed her my flash drive and the pages I'd hidden in my school locker. Her expression as she reviewed the evidence shifted from concern to horror to fierce determination. Jessica's face went pale as she scrolled through the screenshots on my flash drive. Her hands trembled slightly as she read my handwritten documentation from school, each page detailing Jesse's escalating behavior. I watched her expression harden with each piece of evidence, transforming from shock into protective fury. She immediately confronted Mom with everything, spreading the papers across the kitchen table while Jesse stood frozen in the doorway. Mom's initial defensive posture crumbled as Jessica methodically presented each documented incident: the bedroom invasions, the diary theft, the systematic isolation of my support network. The browser history screenshots showing Jesse's research into boarding schools designed for troubled teens made Mom's face drain of color. Jesse attempted to dismiss the evidence as teenage dramatics, but Jessica cut him off with a raised hand. She pulled out her phone and began making calls, first to a family lawyer she knew, then to other relatives who needed to know what was happening. Jesse's carefully maintained facade shattered as he realized his control was slipping away. Mom sat at the table, staring at the evidence with growing horror. Jessica forced her to look at specific incidents. evidence. Timestamps showing Jesse entering my room at night, documentation of friends whose parents had received his poisonous phone calls. Each piece of proof chipped away at the narrative Mom had desperately clung to about Jesse being our family's savior. Jessica announced she was calling Child Protective Services and would seek emergency custody if necessary. The threat of official intervention sent Jesse into damage control mode. He tried bargaining, claiming the boarding school idea was just to help me, that he'd cancel everything if we could handle this as a family. His desperation was palpable as he watched his carefully constructed world unravel. I stood in the corner, watching everything unfold with a strange mixture of relief and terror. Jessica noticed my trembling and positioned herself between Jesse and me, a physical barrier that felt more protective than anything I'd experienced in months. She made it clear that I wouldn't be staying in this house another night. Jesse's final manipulation attempt involved threatening to leave and withdraw all financial support. He reminded Mom about the mortgage payments, the car loans, the credit cards, all the financial chains he'd wrapped around our family. Mom visibly wavered, the fear of returning to poverty warring with the undeniable evidence of what Jesse had been doing to me. Jessica immediately countered by offering temporary financial help if Mom chose to protect me. She laid out the choice starkly. Mom could keep her predator boyfriend and lose her daughter forever, or she could choose her child's safety over financial security. The kitchen felt suffocating as we waited for Mom's decision. Mom's hesitation stretched painfully long. I could see her calculating, weighing her options, and something inside me shattered at the realization that this wasn't an automatic choice for her. Jessica's expression grew increasingly disgusted as the silence lengthened. I made the decision for everyone by walking to my room and beginning to pack. My hands moved mechanically, folding clothes and gathering essentials while tears blurred my vision. I could hear raised voices from the kitchen, but focused only on filling my backpack with everything I could carry. Jessica appeared in my doorway, her face set with determination. She helped me pack, assuring me that I had a safe place with her for as long as I needed. We worked in efficient silence, both understanding that my childhood in this house was ending. Jesse tried blocking our path to the door, but Jessica simply pulled out her phone and began dialing 911. He stepped aside, his face contorting with rage as he realized he'd lost. Mom stood frozen in the hallway, watching her daughter prepare to leave rather than live with a predator she'd chosen over family. The car ride to Jessica's house passed in a blur. I clutched my backpack and stared out the window, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. Jessica kept glancing at me with concern, but didn't push for conversation, understanding I needed time to absorb the reality of my escape. At Jessica's house, she showed me to the guest room that would become my sanctuary. The space felt safe in a way my own bedroom hadn't in months. Jessica helped me unpack, treating me with a gentleness that made me realize how much I'd been living in survival mode. Over the following days, Jessica coordinated with lawyers and social services. She filed for temporary guardianship, documenting everything with the evidence I'd collected. Jesse tried various tactics to regain control, threatening legal action, attempting to contact me directly, even showing up at Jessica's house until she got a restraining order. Mom's calls started tentatively, full of accusations about me destroying our family. But as Jesse's true nature became impossible to ignore without me there as his target, her tone shifted. She began therapy at Jessica's insistence, slowly unpacking how she'd enabled my abuse for financial security. I started my own therapy sessions, finally able to speak freely about everything without fear of Jesse's retaliation. The therapist helped me understand that none of it was my fault, that Jesse had systematically groomed not just me but Mom too, creating a dynamic where his control seemed normal. School became my refuge as I rebuilt my life from Jessica's house. Mrs. Rodriguez and Mr. Chen offered quiet support, understanding without needing details why I'd suddenly moved. My grades slowly improved as the constant stress lifted, proving Jesse's narrative about my deteriorating mental state had always been a lie. Jesse's attempts to maintain contact grew increasingly desperate. He sent letters full of manipulation tactics, alternating between threats, false apologies, and promises to change. Jessica helped me file proper documentation with the police, building a paper trail in case we needed a permanent restraining order. 3 months into living with Jessica, Mom reached out differently. She'd been attending therapy consistently and wanted to meet in a neutral location with her therapist present. Jessica left the choice to me, making it clear I had no obligation to rebuild a relationship with someone who'd chosen a predator over my safety. The meeting was painful but necessary. Mom's therapist guided the conversation as Mom acknowledged her failures, her choice of financial security over my well-being, her willful blindness to Jesse's predatory behavior. She didn't ask for forgiveness. Her therapist had apparently worked with her on understanding that wasn't hers to demand. I listened without committing to anything, still processing my own trauma in therapy. The woman across from me seemed different from the mom who'd screamed at me for embarrassing our family, but I couldn't trust that change yet. Trust would take time, if it came at all. Jesse eventually moved out of state when his reputation in our community became too damaged to maintain his business. The whisper network among local parents ensured he couldn't rebuild his predatory patterns with another vulnerable family. Sarah reached out through Jessica, sharing her own documentation of Jesse's behavior with his daughter, creating a fuller picture of his pattern of targeting teenage girls. 6 months after leaving, I stood in my new bedroom at Jessica's house, now truly mine rather than just a guest room. The space reflected my personality in ways my old room never could, free from the fear of Jesse's invasions. My therapy sessions had decreased to bi-weekly, progress evident in my ability to sleep through the night without checking my door. Mom continued her own therapeutic work, slowly earning back small pieces of trust through consistent actions rather than words. We met monthly in public places, rebuilding a relationship on my terms. She'd downsized her life significantly after Jesse left, learning to manage finances independently for the first time since Dad died. The boarding school brochures Jesse had collected became evidence in the official documentation of his abuse. Those facilities designed to imprison troubled teens had nearly become my reality, but instead, I'd found freedom through Jessica's intervention and my own courage to document the truth. My phone, once a tool of surveillance and control, became normal again. I could text friends without fear of monitoring, browse the internet without dreading interrogation, exist digitally without Jesse's suffocating oversight. Simple freedoms felt revolutionary after months of captivity. School friendships slowly rebuilt as Jesse's poisonous influence faded. Some relationships couldn't be salvaged, the damage too deep from parents who still believed Jesse's narrative about my instability. But new connections formed with people who understood survival and resilience. The flash drive containing Jesse's browser history history remained in Jessica's safe, potential evidence if he ever tried to return. We'd learned through Sarah that he'd attempted similar patterns before, making documentation crucial for protecting future victims. The knowledge that I'd helped create a record that might protect others gave meaning to my suffering. Mom's house, once my prison, stood empty more often as she worked multiple jobs to maintain independence. She'd refused alimony from Jesse, finally understanding that financial ties to an abuser were chains disguised as lifelines. Her struggle was real, but it was honest, something our family hadn't been in years. My 18th birthday approached with Jessica planning a small celebration. The milestone that Jesse had used as a threat, when I'd have to leave if I couldn't show gratitude, instead became a marker of survival and new beginnings. I'd have legal autonomy soon, though Jessica assured me her home would always be mine regardless. The voice recording trapped on my old phone was eventually recovered through legal channels, Jesse's real voice captured forever as evidence. Hearing it during a therapy session helped me process how calculated his manipulation had been, how carefully he'd crafted each violation to maximize control while avoiding consequences. Recovery wasn't linear. Nightmares still came sometimes, body memories of Jesse's unwanted touches making me flinch at unexpected contact, but therapy provided tools. Jessica offered unconditional support, and slowly I rebuilt my sense of safety in the world. The girl who'd laid awake researching boarding schools, terrified of disappearing into Jesse's carefully planned disposal system, had transformed into someone who understood her own strength, not through movie moment revelations, but through daily choices to trust, to heal, to build a life free from predatory control. Mom and I would never have the relationship we might have had if she'd chosen differently. That grief lived alongside my recovery, acknowledged in therapy as a valid loss. But we were both learning, separately and carefully, how to exist in truth rather than Jesse's manufactured reality. My story wasn't unique, as I learned through support groups for survivors of family abuse. Jesse's patterns appeared again and again in other stories: the financial savior who became a predator, the isolation tactics, the boarding school threats. Sharing experiences with others who understood helped dissolve the shame Jesse had cultivated. 9 months after escape, I helped Jessica redecorate the kitchen where I'd first found refuge. We painted over the beige walls with warm colors, creating a space that felt like home rather than just shelter. The physical transformation paralleled my internal rebuilding: slow, intentional, permanent. Mom's latest therapy breakthrough involved recognizing her own childhood patterns that Jesse had exploited. Understanding didn't excuse her choices but provided context for healing. Our monthly meetings had evolved to include occasional texts, small steps toward a fundamentally different relationship. The boarding school Jesse had chosen sent promotional materials to Mom's house for months after, each brochure a reminder of the future he'd planned for me. Mom forwarded them to Jessica's lawyer, adding to the evidence file that would follow Jesse wherever he tried to establish new hunting grounds. My senior year began with possibilities Jesse had tried to steal. College applications replaced boarding school research, my improving grades opening doors he'd tried to close. Teachers who'd witnessed my transformation wrote recommendation letters that spoke to resilience without needing details. Jesse's complete removal from our lives revealed how thoroughly he'd infected every aspect. Mom discovered financial accounts he'd hidden, debts he'd accumulated in her name, damage that would take years to repair. But she faced each challenge without retreating into denial, growth born from accepting harsh truths. The house felt different during my rare visits to collect belongings. Jesse's presence lingered like smoke damage, invisible but pervasive. Mom was planning to sell once she'd stabilized financially, understanding that some spaces couldn't be reclaimed from trauma. Graduation approached with Jessica as my proudest supporter. She'd become more than an aunt, more than a guardian. She was the adult who'd believed me when systems failed, who'd risked family conflict to ensure my safety. The cap and gown I'd wear represented triumph over someone who'd tried to erase my future. Sarah maintained occasional contact, her daughter now in college and thriving after years of distance from Jesse. Their story provided a roadmap for my own healing, proof that survival was possible, that Jesse's damage wasn't permanent. We were linked by shared understanding of his tactics and commitment to preventing future victims. The final therapy session before graduation focused on integration, acknowledging how the experience had shaped me without letting it define me. Jesse had stolen months of my adolescence, but not my capacity for joy, trust, or growth. Those things had been buried but not destroyed, emerging stronger through recovery. Mom attended graduation at my invitation, sitting separately from Jessica but present. Her tears seemed genuine as she watched me walk across the stage, perhaps finally understanding what she'd almost lost to maintain Jesse's approval. The moment was complicated, pride mixed with regret, distance alongside connection. That night, I lay in my bed at Jessica's house, no longer checking locks or startling at footsteps. The girl researching boarding schools on her phone seemed like a different person, though her courage in documenting abuse had made this freedom possible. Jesse was gone, his power dissolved through truth and intervention. The future stretched ahead undefined by Jesse's limitations. College acceptances arrived for programs he'd never wanted me to pursue, dreams he'd tried to suffocate with control. I chose a school several hours away, far enough for independence but close enough for Jessica's continued support. Mom helped me shop for dorm supplies, a careful reconstruction of normal parent-child activities. We navigated around triggers, both learning what felt safe. Her therapy work showed in small ways, asking permission before hugging, respecting boundaries Jesse had demolished. Progress came in increments, trust rebuilt through repetition. The flash drive of evidence found its permanent home in a safety deposit box, insurance against Jesse's potential return. Sarah had taught us that predators often circled back when they thought vigilance had relaxed. We remained prepared without living in fear, balance achieved through practical precautions. My story joined the countless others of teenagers failed by systems meant to protect them, but it also joined stories of survival, of adults who eventually listened, of escape from carefully constructed traps. Jesse had built my prison methodically, but I documented my way to freedom. Moving into my dorm room felt like the final step in reclaiming autonomy. Jessica helped me arrange the space, both of us crying as we acknowledged how far we'd come from that desperate kitchen confrontation. The room was small, but it was mine, chosen rather than assigned by a predator's design. Mom texted photos of the empty house the day she finally moved out. She'd found a small apartment she could afford independently, the first space in years not contaminated by Jesse's presence. Our parallel journeys toward independence intersected occasionally, but no longer defined each other. The girl who'd hidden torn textbook pages in her locker had evolved into someone who spoke openly about surviving family family abuse, not for attention or sympathy, but because silence had nearly destroyed me. If my story helped one teenager recognize the patterns, document the abuse, find their Jessica, then every moment of pain held purpose.